In 1979, on what seemed like a perfect summer evening, a 9-year-old girl's life changed forever. One moment she was watching television and laughing at a comedy show. The next, she was learning that someone wanted her entire family dead. This is the story of the Busby family, whose year of terror began with a single shotgun blast that shattered more than just a car window. It destroyed their sense of safety, their home, and forced them into a life they never imagined possible. Picture this. It's August 31st, 1979, the Friday before Labor Day weekend. The Busby family is spending their evening in the driveway, painting a car while the summer sun sets over Cape Cod. 9-year-old Cylin Busby has no idea this will be the last normal moment of her childhood. Her father, John Busby, is getting ready for his midnight shift as a police sergeant in Falmouth, Massachusetts. Everything seems ordinary, peaceful even, but in small towns like Falmouth, ordinary can become extraordinary in the span of a heartbeat. And sometimes, that heartbeat stops altogether. John Busby wasn't just any police officer. He was the kind of cop who didn't care about your connections, your family name, or how much money you had. If you broke the law, you faced the consequences, period. This unwavering commitment to justice had earned him respect from honest citizens and hatred from those who thought they were above the law. Unfortunately for the Busby family, one of those people had decided that John Busby needed to be silenced permanently. As John drove to work that night, less than half a mile from his house, a car pulled up behind him. At first, it seemed like any other vehicle on the road, but then it pulled alongside his Volkswagen, matching his speed. In that moment, John realized this wasn't a normal traffic situation. Someone was hunting him. The blast from the shotgun tore through the driver's side window with devastating force. The impact ripped through John's face, destroying his lower jaw and leaving him barely conscious. But in those crucial seconds before darkness took hold, he managed to do something that would save his family's lives. He wrote 2 words that would change everything, not an accident. John Busby knew instantly who wanted him dead. He'd crossed paths with dangerous people before, but one name stood out above all others. Someone who had a reputation for making problems disappear, sometimes along with the people who caused them. Someone who had been suspected in multiple disappearances and murders but had never been held accountable. Someone whose favorite saying was, "I smell smoke," which wasn't a comment about the weather, but a thinly veiled threat that your property might mysteriously catch fire. Meanwhile, back at the Busby house, 9-year-old Cylin was settling in for what she thought would be a normal evening. She was watching Benny Hill on television, laughing at the comedy sketches, completely unaware that her father was fighting for his life just minutes away. Her mother Polly was studying to become a nurse. Her 2 older brothers, Eric and Sean, were probably getting ready for bed. Their cousin Kelly, who helped with babysitting duties, was keeping an eye on things. Then came the knock at the door that shattered their world. When Cylin heard someone crying or screaming, she initially thought it was coming from the television. But as the sounds continued, she realized something was terribly wrong. She came out of her room to find her father's colleague, Rick Smith, in uniform, speaking to her mother who was crying and screaming, repeatedly saying no, 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 and trying to push him away. The confusion was overwhelming. Nobody was explaining what had happened. There was just chaos, fear, and the terrible realization that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Cylin stood there, asking what was happening. But the adults were too consumed by their own shock and panic to notice her. What Cylin didn't know yet was that her father was lying in a hospital bed, unable to speak, unable to breathe on his own, but very much alive and very much aware of who had tried to kill him. What she also didn't know was that this shooting wasn't just about her father. It was about sending a message to anyone who dared to challenge certain people in their small town. And if those people were willing to shoot a police officer, they certainly wouldn't hesitate to finish the job by eliminating his family. The note John managed to write in his hospital bed contained more than just the words, "Not an accident." He also wrote, "Polly and the kids are not safe." This wasn't the rambling of a man in shock. This was the clear, calculated warning of someone who understood exactly what kind of enemy they were dealing with. In Falmouth, Massachusetts, there was one person everyone knew you didn't cross. Melvin Rain was in the trash hauling business, which might sound harmless enough, but his methods of dealing with competition and problems were anything but ordinary. He was a convicted arsonist with a reputation for getting even with people by sneaking around at night and burning their property, houses, cars, businesses. If Melvin had a problem with you, something you owned might mysteriously go up in flames, but arson was just the beginning. Melvin was also suspected of murder. Not one murder, not two, but 3 separate cases where people had disappeared or turned up dead under suspicious circumstances. His own wife, Wanda, had vanished in 1971 after he claimed to have dropped her off at a bus station. She was never seen again. A teenage boy who had been dating a girl Melvin was interested in was found shot to death in a cranberry bog directly across from Melvin's house. A 17-year-old former employee who was set to testify against Melvin in a grand jury investigation got on a ferry to Martha's Vineyard but never got off. In each case, Melvin walked free. The pattern was always the same. People who crossed him or posed a threat to him seemed to disappear or meet unfortunate ends. But there was never enough evidence to charge him. Or perhaps there were people in positions of power who were too afraid to go after him. This was the man John Busby had been willing to confront when others wouldn't. This was the man who had decided that a police officer who couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated needed to be eliminated. And this was the man who now posed an ongoing threat to a family that included 3 young children. Back at the hospital, doctors were working frantically to save John's life. The damage was so severe that they had never seen anything like it. His face was unrecognizable. His jaw was gone, and he couldn't speak, breathe, or eat without mechanical assistance. But he was alive, and he was determined to stay that way for one reason: his family needed him to survive so he could protect them from what was coming next. Because this story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. As the Busby family tried to process what had happened, the reality of their situation began to sink in. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Someone had specifically targeted John Busby for elimination, and that same someone would likely not be satisfied with a failed attempt. The police response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the shooting, the Busby house was surrounded by law enforcement. Squad cars filled the driveway. Officers with rifles took positions around the property. The message was clear. This family was now under siege, and everyone understood that the danger was far from over. For 9-year-old Cylin, the transformation was jarring. One day, she was a normal kid living in a normal house on Cape Cod. The next day, armed guards were stationed outside her bedroom window. Police officers followed her to school, sat outside her classroom, and watched her eat lunch. Every movement was monitored. Every person who came near her was scrutinized. The psychological impact on the children was immediate and profound. At school, word spread quickly about what had happened. Some children were curious, others were frightened, and many were simply told by their parents to stay away from the Busby kids. Cylin found herself sitting alone at lunch tables, excluded from playground games, and treated like a walking target. One particularly cruel classmate even told her directly that everyone knew someone was trying to kill her family and that they might be next. The family's home became a fortress. An 8-foot fence was erected around the property. A sophisticated alarm system was installed. Windows were covered. Doors remained locked at all times. The family dog, Tiger, was given away and replaced with Max, a trained attack dog whose sole purpose was to eliminate any threat to John Busby or his family. Max wasn't a pet. He was a weapon with 4 legs and a set of teeth designed to kill. But perhaps the most unsettling change was in John himself. When he finally came home from the hospital months later, he was a different person entirely. The injuries to his face were so severe that he was barely recognizable. His jaw had been reconstructed, but the damage went far beyond the physical. The man who had once been playful and affectionate with his children now seemed emotionally distant. The father who used to roughhouse and tell jokes had been replaced by someone who was constantly vigilant, always watching, always planning. The financial burden on the family was crushing. John's compensation for being shot in the line of duty was $200 per week, hardly enough to support a family of 5, let alone a family that needed round-the-clock security. The town of Falmouth was spending enormous amounts of money on police protection, and it was becoming clear that this arrangement couldn't continue indefinitely. Meanwhile, the investigation into the shooting was going nowhere. Despite John's clear indication of who was responsible, despite the obvious motive, and despite Melvin Rain's history of violence, no arrests were made, no charges were filed, no justice was served. It was as if the shooting had never happened, at least from an official standpoint. This lack of action wasn't just frustrating, it was terrifying. If the police couldn't or wouldn't go after the person who had tried to murder one of their own officers, what protection could they really offer his family? The Busbys were living in a state of constant fear, never knowing when the next attempt on their lives might come. John's anger was building to dangerous levels. In his hospital bed, he had initially focused on survival and recovery. But as the months passed and it became clear that no official justice would be forthcoming, his thoughts turned to a different kind of solution. He began to contemplate taking matters into his own hands. The idea of hunting down Melvin Rain and finishing what had been started that night in August became more than just a fantasy. It became a plan. The family was trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. They couldn't live normally because of the constant threat. They couldn't rely on the justice system because it had failed them completely. They couldn't even trust their own community because too many people were either afraid of Melvin Rain or somehow connected to him. As winter turned to spring and spring turned to summer, it became increasingly clear that something had to change. The Busby family couldn't continue living as prisoners in their own home. The town couldn't continue spending money on protection that might not even be effective. And John couldn't continue to heal, physically or emotionally, while surrounded by daily reminders of the violence that had been done to him. The solution, when it finally came, was as drastic as it was necessary. If the Busby family couldn't be safe in Falmouth, Massachusetts, then they would have to leave Falmouth, Massachusetts, not just for a vacation or a temporary relocation, but permanently. They would have to disappear completely, leaving behind everything they had ever known and starting over somewhere new, somewhere safe, somewhere that Melvin Rain couldn't find them. But leaving meant more than just packing their belongings and driving away. It meant abandoning their identities, their history, their connections to the community where they had lived their entire lives. It meant the children would have to learn to lie about their past, create false stories about why they had moved, and never speak the truth about what had happened to their father. Most importantly, it meant that John Busby would have to make a choice. He could stay and pursue the violent revenge that was consuming his thoughts, or he could prioritize his family's safety and disappear with them into whatever new life awaited them far from Cape Cod. The decision would define not just the next chapter of their story, but the rest of their lives. In the end, the choice was made for them. The town of Falmouth, faced with mounting security costs and no resolution in sight, made it clear that the easiest solution was for the Busby family to simply disappear, rather than continue the expensive protection detail or pursue justice against the person responsible. It was more convenient for everyone involved if the victims just went away. The message was unmistakable. It's easier for you to live somewhere else than to live here. We'll save money, and you'll be on your way. After everything John had sacrificed in service to his community, after taking a shotgun blast to the face in the line of duty, this was his reward. The town that he had protected was essentially telling him that his family's safety was less important than their budget. So in the summer of 1980, almost exactly 1 year after the shooting, the Busby family began their exodus from Cape Cod. They loaded their belongings into a car and started driving south, with no clear destination except somewhere safe. They had pulled the names of towns out of a hat, places where Polly might find work as a nurse, and Tennessee had won the lottery of their desperation. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. They were given a police escort to the Bourne Bridge, the boundary that separates Cape Cod from the mainland. It was both a gesture of respect and a clear message, goodbye and good riddance. You're not our problem anymore, as they crossed that bridge, leaving behind everything they had ever known. The children understood that they weren't just moving to a new town. They were entering a witness protection program of their own design, one where they would have to reinvent themselves completely. The people they had been, the Busby family of Falmouth, Massachusetts, were disappearing forever. The drive south felt like descending into hell. As they traveled further from the familiar coastline of Cape Cod, the temperature rose and the landscape became increasingly foreign. For children who had grown up with ocean breezes and familiar neighborhoods, the rural expanses of the American South felt like exile to another planet. When they finally reached their destination in Tennessee, the culture shock was immediate and overwhelming. Everything was different. The accents, the food, the social customs, even the way people looked at strangers. The Busby children, with their New England sensibilities and traumatic baggage, stood out like beacons in their new community. But standing out was exactly what they couldn't afford to do. So they began the painful process of transformation. Cylin got a perm and started practicing a Southern accent. She learned to apply lip gloss and dress like the local girls. Most importantly, she learned to lie about their past, about why they had moved, about what was wrong with her father's face, about everything that mattered. John grew a massive beard that obscured most of the damage to his face. He found work on a farm, spending his days splitting wood and doing physical labor that seemed to help process some of his rage. The repetitive motion of swinging an axe through logs became a form of therapy, a way to channel the violence that still simmered inside him. For a while, it seemed like the healing might actually work. The family began to find their rhythm in this new place. The constant fear that had defined their existence in Massachusetts gradually faded. The children started making friends. Polly found work as a nurse. They were still looking over their shoulders, still careful about who they trusted. But life began to feel somewhat normal again. But John's anger hadn't disappeared. It had just gone underground. Every few months, He would have to return to Boston for reconstructive surgery, and each trip forced him to confront what had been done to him. When he shaved his beard for these procedures, he would see the full extent of his injuries in the mirror, and the rage would come flooding back. During one of these trips, his uncle presented him with a gift, a rifle with a scope and a silencer, everything he would need to hunt down Melvin Rain and finish what had been started that night in 1979. For a moment, John was tempted. The weapon represented everything he had dreamed about during those dark months of recovery. But something had changed. The man who had once fantasized about revenge had been replaced by someone who understood that his family's peace was worth more than his personal vengeance. He looked at the gun, wrote a note to his uncle, and walked away. "Thank you for your effort," he wrote. "I won't need it." That decision marked a turning point. When John returned to Tennessee, he told his family he was done with surgery, done with trips to Boston, done with living in the past. They were going to embrace their new life and move forward as the people they had become, not the people they used to be. Years passed. The children grew up, went to college, started families of their own. The trauma never fully disappeared, but it became manageable. The family had survived not just the original attack, but the year of terror that followed and the complete upheaval of their lives. Then, in 2003, 24 years after the shooting, something unexpected happened. The Rain family had started turning on each other, fighting over money and spilling family secrets to the police. John Rain, Melvin's brother, finally came clean about what had happened that night in August 1979. The confession provided the vindication that John Busby had been seeking for more than 2 decades. His instincts had been correct. Melvin Rain had indeed been the one who ordered the hit. John Rain described how his brother had sat in the back seat of their car with a ski mask and a shotgun, waiting for the perfect moment to fire through John's window. But vindication came with a bitter irony. By the time the confession was made, the statute of limitations had expired. No charges could be filed. No justice could be served through the legal system. Melvin Rain would never face trial for attempted murder. In a way, though, justice had been served by other means. Melvin Rain was confined to a state institution, suffering from what was reported to be Pick's disease, a form of dementia that affects the brain. The man who had once terrorized an entire community was now powerless, his mind deteriorating, his capacity for violence neutralized by his own failing health. For the Busby family, the confession brought closure of a different kind. They had built new lives far from Cape Cod, lives that were fuller and richer than what they had left behind. Cylin became a successful author, writing books for children and drawing on her experiences to help others understand resilience and survival. John and Polly found peace in their rural Tennessee home, surrounded by the natural beauty that had helped heal their wounds. The year they disappeared had ended, but the people they became in its aftermath had endured. They had proven that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about finding ways to thrive despite the worst that life can throw at you. They had learned that sometimes running away isn't cowardice. It's the bravest thing you can do to protect the people you love. Looking back, Cylin would say that she couldn't imagine being anyone other than who that terrible year had made her. The trauma had touched every part of her life, but it had also given her strength, perspective, and an appreciation for safety and normalcy that most people never develop. She had lived through something that should have destroyed her family, and instead, it had ultimately made them stronger. The Busby family's story is a testament to the power of choosing life over revenge, healing over hatred, and love over fear. They disappeared from one life and created another, proving that sometimes the best way to defeat your enemies is simply to refuse to let them define your future. In the end, they had won, not through violence or legal justice, but through the simple act of surviving and building something beautiful from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The year they disappeared had become the foundation for decades of peace, love, and happiness that followed. And perhaps that's the most powerful victory of all.